Hello and welcome back to the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan. I'm here with Ariella Thornhill. Ariella, what's new?
Oh, I moved my desk.
Yeah, your background is vaguely
That's one of
different
the big
now. There's
things.
like a
Yeah,
different
I
angle.
zoomed out on my library. Yeah,
You
I'm
were
really
getting too many
excited.
comments about your Stalin book.
I
So
was. People are gonna have to like zoom in and do some of the like enhance, NCIS stuff to figure out what's on my bookshelf now.
So, speaking of books, we have the author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, Kristen Ghodsee. She'll be coming on a little later. And I also wanted to mention on the subject of books, Ariella, you are writing a book. I don't know that we've ever talked about this on the Jacobin Show before, but it's called Socialist Sex Ed. It'll be out from Verso Books in 2022. So before we bring on Kristen, I wanted to talk to you about your book and also about the history of sex education in the US. So I guess just to kind of kick off, tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, this happened long before our Sex and the State episode was conceived of. But when my son was little, I was having a conversation with some friends of mine who are socialists, like very active political women. And we were talking about how we're going to talk to our kids about sex ed. And as a teacher, as a former teacher, I know that the best approach is to be as open as possible, to center things around, pleasure and consent and the ways that bodies and preferences change and stuff like that. But I wanted to read a book, and one of my friends suggested a book about sex ed in the Netherlands, which is great. They have great sex education. And we all read the book together, and it was really nice. There are some cool things in there. They're much more open about pleasure, and they're much more pleasure centered in their sex education. So there's a chapter about this woman, the author, going to a sex museum with her daughter's class, and there's like a wall of screens of people having orgasms, and it's like giving someone the gift of pleasure is a wonderful thing to share with them. And she was shocked because this is an elementary school class, but they're extremely open. The thing that struck me, though, and I think we'll talk about this a lot during this episode, and it's something that Kristen's work follows quite a bit, is that it completely ignored the state institutions that enable that kind of message and that kind of openness and the destigmatization of certain things. So it started me on a search frantically for an age appropriate book, to help work through these. And there are some great books by Seven Story, out from Seven Stories, the publisher. Sex is a Funny Word is a great book. But I wanted something that kind of taught socialism and sex education at the same time, that moved away from this narrative of individual liberation, right? And looked at the way that society and state institutions change people's sex lives and affect the way that they interact with each other. And I couldn't find it, so I started to write it.
The classic response to when there's no book that's currently out there for you.
Exactly.
I want to bring up just a couple of the illustrations from your book, because again, you are intending this book for a kind of younger adult reading audience, and they're really great illustrations, which Ariella shared with me before. So I thought
these
we
are
should
by
pull some of
Katie
them.
Shelley. I've got to plug her; she's incredible. Katie Shelley is the illustrator. So yeah, this is the introduction to the chapter on bodies. The structure of the book is kind of zooming in up on, who you are and what's happening to your body. It's for kids, currently going through puberty. And then it's like, what's happening to your body? What happens to your body and someone else's body when they're together? And then what happens to your body and everyone else's body? So the first chapter is about the changes in your body. And even those, the way that they're discussed in the US, are definitely through the prism of a kind of gender binary that I think is scientifically inaccurate. For instance, you learn if you're a boy, you'll grow hair on your face. That's not true. A lot of people grow hair on their face. It can be really alienating to be presented information in a way that looks at the differences and not the commonalities.
So let's get into that sort of thorny history of sex education in the US, because when we were talking earlier, we talked about how we both grew up in states where in our public school system, the only sex education that we really got was abstinence only sex ed. And, abstinence only sex ed is this kind of classically conservative, or it's a plank that a lot of conservatives push on public schools. Although I will say that it actually grew out of Clinton's welfare reform in the 90s. So again, a little bipartisan consensus there. I think that when it comes to abstinence only sex ed, it's not, again, like I was saying, it's not just a kind of conservative, an ultra conservative red state thing. It is imposed on many different states. I think part of what you're going to talk about is how things are just so different from state to state in the US. Again, thank you, American federalism, that it's just really hard to make sense of what such sex education is today. But I want to bring up just one quick chart here. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and they show that in 2018, and we're looking at the orange slice here, a third of federal funding went to abstinence only until marriage programs. So again, this is actually still a pretty widespread way of talking about sex in public schools. So I know that, again, sex education is or the history of sex education is something that you have been researching for your book and, elsewhere. So give us the dirty, like what has the history of sex ed in the US been like?
Well, it's not great. And you're right. It's not just limited to this kind of conservative ethos. But I do think that there was a overarching idea that if you teach kids about sex in an honest way, you encourage them to have sex. I don't think those people have interacted with high schoolers because I don't really think it's the teacher telling them, oh, here's what contraception is that makes them want to have sex. Sex is a drive, like hunger is a drive, like sleep is a drive, right? This is a human need that people have to varying degrees, and it develops within your own body. It's not possible to shut it down by eliminating information about it. It would be like saying, well, we won't have hunger in America if we don't have ads for food, right? But abstinence only sex ed was, as you said, a Clinton era welfare reform policy that was passed in 1996. The bill earmarked $250 million over 5 years to teach Americans that engaging in sex before marriage is likely to have harmful psychological and physical effects, and that abstinence from extramarital sex is the expected standard of human behavior, which is like a really, really loaded statement. And that didn't go away. I want to pull up this ad that I asked Kale to get. That's a photo of a child. These were all over the New York City subways about 5 or 6 years ago. It says, I'm twice as likely not to graduate high school because you had me as a teen. And then teens were encouraged to text for more information about sex and abstinence. Obviously, this ad campaign drew a lot of ire. There were different iterations of it with sad-looking babies being like, is he really going to stay with you just because I'm in the picture? Just horrible, horrible, shame-based approach to sex education. But it has deep roots in American culture and in American politics. The goal was to actually target low-income and minority communities. And these programs popped up across the United States because it was generally believed that if you targeted these communities, you could prevent these kinds of ill outcomes. And I want to say something that might sound a little bad, but you do have worse outcomes if you have a child as a teenager in this country.
Yeah, I was going to say that. It is very high stakes.
Yes, that is not because you made a horrible decision. In many instances, people aren't really making a choice here, right? That's one of the big things about this. But the other thing is, we've created a system where you get those bad outcomes.
Exactly,
so if you look at
exactly.
other countries, you don't see the same things. You're not going to see the same results. You're not going to see single motherhood tied to the same kinds of outcomes for kids and mothers. You're not going to see extramarital sex tied to the same outcomes as you see here. These are designed outcomes, and they're outcomes that we can change, not by individual shame, but by changing the institutions that people live within.
So I want to, oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, Obama tried to change this a little bit. This is one of the things that Obama did manage to do. He created a kind of centrist, middle of the road approach to sex education that combined abstinence-only programs with more comprehensive approaches to sex ed. And that program was called PrEP, or Personal Responsibility Education Programs. They both teach abstinence. The abstinence-only curriculum obviously does, the PrEP curriculum does. But they wanted the PrEP curriculum to also provide students with medically accurate information, which is not actually legally required in a lot of states.
Yeah. That's a little scary.
Yeah, it is.
So I, because we've been talking about how, sex and teen pregnancy in the US, because of the lack of social support, is so high stakes. I want to follow up by asking you about, so something that you've talked about in your book is that you believe that it's really important that sex education starts early and that it be low stakes. So that's kind of the opposite, I guess, of what it is in the US today. So what do you mean when you say you want, or you think that sex ed should be low stakes, and how do we do that?
So right now, you're exactly right. We have extremely high stakes messaging around sex. And part of that is a reflection of reality. Like we both said earlier, these are outcomes that do happen quite frequently if you have extramarital sex or if you get a sexually transmitted infection. We know that we can mitigate that by having institutions to provide free birth control or treat infections for free. But the approach to sex ed in the US is also high stakes because there is a general stigma around sex, a general belief that it can't be part of a healthy conversation. And it does two pretty awful things to a child's psyche. One is children naturally learn and explore how their bodies work, how they feel, and what it means to be interacting with another person's body. And that happens from the moment you're born. You can't recognize like shapes and colors, but you can see a human face. And the way that we respond to infants is a reflection of this deep social need to connect through touch and through look. So these things are inbuilt, and we do provide children low stakes ways of learning about touch and consent and pleasure through free play in schools, where they get to hug each other, or they play house, or they play in a sandbox. We create environments where they can safely learn social lessons and they're socially reinforced. But when it comes to sex, there's like a huge barrier, right? And we live in a society now that I think is really questioning how we tackle this, but has not yet accepted that it's a deep human need. We know that we need to do things to support other human needs so that people thrive. Touch is a human need. Connection is a human need. These go outside of sex, but they're nested within all of our ways of social interaction. So making a low stakes environment for kids to learn about sex ed means reframing how we approach sex, teaching sex as something that's pleasurable, something that's good, something that's a type of physical empathy with another person, where you're connecting and learning about them, learning to listen, learning to be rejected in a safe way, learning to deal with some of the negative feelings that come along with that, possessiveness, jealousy. All of these things are deeply human. They indicate how powerful of a need we have to connect. And if that feels denied, people can have a strong reaction. But instead, what we've got is a system that denies that sex is a need, denies that it's part of human experience, and places the kind of normal experimentation that kids do into a criminal category. And sometimes that's a very real criminal category. So we lack the public space and the private space for a lot of people to explore their bodies or somebody else's body. And we funnel these kinds of interactions onto social media. People will find a way to connect, no matter what. But there are more and more laws cropping up that criminalize kids sending like a nude selfie to another kid as child pornography and basically mark them for life. When we know that there's a real difference between somebody being exploited and somebody kind of playfully trying to experiment with their sexual identity through a photo on a phone.
So I guess I agree with, what you just laid out. And I actually suspect that like 99% of liberal feminists or like other progressives would also agree. Like we need a healthier relationship to not just our own bodies, but to sex and the way that we interact with each other. Abstinence-only sex education is obviously failing kids, is overly punitive and doesn't work. Like it doesn't actually reduce teen pregnancy rates or reduce, STIs among teens or anything like that. So again, I think that a lot of progressives would agree, we need a more, I guess you could call it sex positive approach to talking about these issues. But what differentiates the kind of progressive sex positive model of sex education with socialist sex education?
So the big difference there is one focuses on removing stigma, right? And there are great books about this, and that is important. Shout Your Abortion is like, maybe the foremost in this, particularly because of the title, right? It's like, you get this medical procedure, don't be ashamed, you have the right to this, you have agency here, let's not alienate people because of their medical choices. But that assumes the choice is there. And that choice is not there for millions of people. And then when you look at it on a community level, if you lack access to abortion or contraception or treatment for sexually transmitted infections, it actually affects the broader community that you live in and everybody, because we have sex with each other. We connect to each other. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us that. So we don't exist in a bubble of individual choices made under completely similar circumstances for every single person. And then the choices that are available to individuals affect the choices that are available to others and affect the outcomes for others. So I would say the liberal feminist or progressive approach around destigmatization is great, but it puts the cart before the horse, because you can't destigmatize something that you can't have access to. And this is true in so many kind of topics around sex and gender. If you want to help trans kids feel fully accepted and embraced in their communities, that's wonderful. But it's also an issue if they don't have access to the healthcare resources that can help them have agency over their health and their appearance and their body. So in so many of these circumstances, people are talking about an individual's validation, an individual's self-esteem, as though that's the foundation of these kinds of social shifts, rather than the economic reality and material reality of that person being the foundation of their self-esteem, validation, and self-worth.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And it makes me think that the kind of disjunct is just the classic disjunct between a kind of liberal idealism and like what we might call materialism. I think so to go back to your point about abortion and, shouting your abortion, I agree. Like, that's great. People, abortion should be destigmatized, but I don't think, you alluded to this. I think that something like over 80% of counties in the US lack an abortion provider. And of course, it is not, it's not federally funded, right? So, cost is oftentimes a barrier as well. So it isn't just about stigma, but I think it's fair to say that the material barriers help perpetuate the stigma.
Yes.
So I actually want to.
Absolutely true. And I think that's true of a broad array of things, like housing, the way that housing affects pleasure. The progressive and liberal narratives focus a lot on oppressed groups and the way that oppressed groups lack access to like a broader category of human rights. So you hear people talk about the Black experience in America, and it's like, I can't even feel safe. And this is happening with people focusing on anti-Asian discrimination and hate, saying, I don't even feel safe in the spaces that I'm in. I don't feel like I can go and have a normal day where I'm not going to be threatened. It's obviously true in those cases that these things are happening, but we don't look at other issues in the same way. So when people talk about the lack of access to housing or the wealth gap for Black people, or issues around gendered pay, they're linking material issues to people's like broader enjoyment of life. We have the same thing going on with material issues and people's broader enjoyment of pleasure and other people. So there are barriers to pleasure that a bunch of people are facing. There's inequity there and inequality there, but we don't really have a framework of talking about it, because actually the need is so broad that it doesn't fit like a particular set of oppressed people. And we have a much harder time in this country saying like material deprivation and lack of resources and institutional support changes people's life outcomes in general, right? And there are certain things that are good for everyone because we share them as like human beings.
So on that note, I want to go back to an example that you had mentioned earlier about the Netherlands, because when I was, looking at like examples of different countries' sex education programs, I also came across an article in the New York Times which talked about which contrasted the kind of like abstinence-only puritanical American style of sex ed with sex ed in France and the Netherlands. This is by a writer called Pamela Druckerman, who I think, wrote a book about how French people raise their children. That was a very popular topic, like moms in other countries for a while.
Everyone loved it. And French women eat cheese and don't get fat.
Exactly. Yeah, it was like part of that. But so I want to read a quote from her article because it was actually really interesting. And again, you talked about this earlier, but she writes, apparently, the Dutch are at the forefront of sex education and they have little trouble broaching the topic. Parents in the Netherlands have lots of casual, age-appropriate talks about sex with their kids over many years, beginning when children are small. Mandatory sex education begins in elementary school and includes lessons on respecting people who are transgender, bisexual, or gay. So obviously that sounds great. And I know that, from your research or from the book that you had mentioned earlier, you have like other examples of how great Dutch sex ed is. But I think, what we're trying to get at is it's not just a matter of culture. It's not that the Dutch have just figured out a way to be more enlightened than Americans. What else is going on here? Like, why is this picture incomplete? And why can't we just look at what the Dutch do and replicate that here?
Yeah, I think the way people understand these other models has a blind spot because we have a way of kind of nesting issues within the individual. And so these kinds of narratives of changing individual thoughts and feelings are extremely popular with liberals. That's our approach to racism, right? Is like, make people nicer. Or I don't know, shame them.
Right, I was going to say, make them feel bad about their own racism or something.
Tell them they can't cry.
Right.
Yeah, these ways of saying, if we make the following individual interventions and change people's thoughts and feelings, we'll change the institutions, or suddenly we'll just have better and different outcomes. But that's just a lie. It's a nice thought that I think is based in a primarily democratic ontology. I hate to use that word.
You're allowed this one time.
People believe that our society is made up of discrete individuals' beliefs and feelings, and that's what's shaping our world. And that would be great. And that is the goal of democracy. And for democratic socialists, that's what we want. But we do not live in that world. We don't live in a world where being a single mother as a teenager is hard because the people around you are meaner to you. We don't live in a world where being a trans kid is difficult just because people are intolerant of your identity. That's a big part of it, but it's also because we don't have a housing guarantee.
Right.
We don't have the ability for people to have consistent, well-paying jobs. We don't have the ability for people to fall back on a social safety net that would protect them and make sure these consequences aren't so dire. And
we don't have universal health care.
Yeah, we're not the Netherlands. We don't have the economic structure of the Netherlands. We haven't taken certain things out of the market. One of the things that's really striking when you dig into this narrative is that the Dutch have like a beautiful package of free services for teens specifically who are sexually active. So in the book I read, you know, she's talking about how it seems like a much more feminist society in the Netherlands. And she's right that there are certain things that are cultural, right? Stigma-free conversations. Yeah, the museum. It's definitely a vector of culture creation, I guess. But the other part is 100% of the cost of contraception, except for condoms, is covered by universal state insurance until you're 21. And the same is true with an abortion. If you're under 16, you need permission from a parent to receive an abortion. But if you don't want to, or there's a circumstance where you can't ask that parent, a doctor can give you permission. The morning after pill is available over the counter at pharmacies. You can have consultations with doctors and STI checks and treatment that's free and confidential. So there's two things going on. One is like many adults here don't have that. But the other is that teenagers absolutely don't have that. And teenagers' medical rights vary state to state, as does their sex education, as does the healthcare systems that they're within. And so you see this kind of fracturing out of worse or better outcomes for people, depending on the community they live in, simply because of their access to resources within that community.
So it looks like we are about to bring on Kristen, but before we do that, I have one last quick question for you. Do you think the state should be involved in sex? Because, you know, we've been talking a lot about state interventions, I guess, but I guess, you know, for me, this is maybe like the one area in which I am maybe vaguely libertarian. Like, I don't think it's any of the state's business what I'm doing with my sex life, and it shouldn't be the state's business. But I think that what you're getting at, or like what we've been talking about in a sort of roundabout way, is that the state can make interventions in other areas of life in order to make sex not its business. Maybe that sounds a little convoluted, but I don't know. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think the state is already involved in everyone's sex
exactly.
life. I think we've been having this, what people think is a culture war is not a culture war with sex. It's a resource war. And the right is winning. They are shutting abortion clinics down. They are making it more and more difficult to get contraception. They're making it more difficult to just get basic access to healthcare.
Right.
So the state is already involved. And our job as, you know, political actors is to say how it should be involved. And I think you're right. When you give people the broad economic foundation for freedom, like the right to public space, the right to private space, a guaranteed home, the right to a guaranteed income, and healthcare that's accessible and easy to get to, you enable a much broader set of freedoms. And
exactly.
All of those are related to our sociality. Sex is just one of those things. I think putting such a strong emphasis on it has been to the detriment of US. Well, depends on if you're on the right, then you've loved it.
Yeah, you're like, this is the best.
Yeah, they're fighting that war and trying to make it seem like, you know, anybody on the side of sexual freedom, gender freedom, what have you, is like depraved. You know, we saw this with LGBTQ rights in the 90s and early 2000s. There have been really good strides made on the cultural end in the US. People are generally more tolerant. There's an expansion of the understanding of what a relationship looks like and who it's with. But we have not made any of those strides with the kind of material basis for freedom that is the material basis for sexual freedom as well.
I think that is actually the perfect note to bring out our guest, Kristen Ghodsee. Kristen is professor of Russian and East European Studies and a member of the graduate group in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of 10 books, including, of course, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. This book, I just learned from Kale, has been translated into many different languages, including a number of Eastern European languages. So kind of coming full circle to the topic at hand. Kristen, welcome to the Jacobin Show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun to be here.
Glad to have you. So, you know, as we just saw, your book has been translated into a number of different languages. You have been interviewed in Jacobin. I believe you've written for Jacobin. Your argument has been in the New York Times and other, you know, large publications. So I think that a fair number of Jacobin's viewers are probably familiar with your argument already, but just to get everybody kind of up to speed, I wondered if you could sort of kick off by just laying out for us why women in the Soviet bloc had better sex than their counterparts in capitalist nations.
Yeah, so I mean, it basically has to do with the subtitle of the book, which is, you know, and other arguments for economic independence. I think it's a complicated argument. I try to lay that out in the book very clearly in the sense that, you know, obviously Eastern Bloc countries were more secular, so there was less influence of religion. And, you know, some people say, well, there was just less to do because, you know, there was less shopping and less entertainment and fewer television channels. And certainly there weren't like phones and things like that. So I've heard that argument that, you know, maybe everybody was having, you know, more sex or better sex back before we were all distracted by various screens. But the argument that I really focus on in the book is this idea that the expansion of the social safety net, as well as investments in women's education, training, and their incorporation into the labor force, allowed women to choose their partners. And I primarily speak here about heterosexual relationships, of course, because I'm talking about like communist era Eastern Europe. But because women had a fair amount of economic independence, they were able to choose their partners on the basis of love, affection, attraction, rather than choosing their partners on the basis of whether or not your partner can pay your rent or put food on the table. So basically, human relationships, and particularly sexual relationships, become less of a transaction. They become less commodified. And when they're less commodified, as somebody like Alexander Kollontai predicted, then people generally tend to be with people that they love rather than people that they need in order to survive. And so at the end of the day, I look at what happened before 1989 in Eastern Europe and what happened before 1991 in the Soviet Union, and then what happened afterwards. And I use the collapse of communism as a natural experiment to say, okay, well, guess what happens when capitalism comes? People's sexuality gets commodified all over again. So it actually is the proof. The proof is in the pudding, right? You can see very clearly from a sociological point of view that you go from less commodified, less transactional relationships to more commodified, more transactional relationships when your social safety nets have been eviscerated and when women's sexuality once again becomes a commodity.
Yeah, great. I loved your book. I'm using it in my book. I think it proves just a really fundamental point about the way that relationships can be warped depending on, you know, your reliance on those individuals that you're with and the way that you said these things get wrapped up into a kind of market of commodities. Can you talk about how ideas of women's sexual freedom in the Soviet bloc differed from like second wave feminists or the kind of liberal feminist approach to sexual freedom?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this is like a really important point because second wave sexuality, often tended to be very much about the individual. As all second wave feminist, liberal feminist sorts of ideologies are about individual self-actualization, individual autonomy, finding kind of a way for people to thrive in a capitalist society without being oppressed by sexist discrimination. Whereas in the Eastern Bloc, and I would say that this is not only true of the Eastern Bloc countries, I think this is also true of like the democratic socialist countries in Scandinavia. Sexuality is seen as much more of a community resource, right? Like if people are having better sex, if people are having better relationships with their partners, if people are happier at home, then there's less isolation, there's less anger, there's less need for like consumption, buying things that you don't really want just because you feel lonely and empty and you need to somehow fill this chasm in your soul with some consumer goods because you don't, have a good set of relationships. So I have friends and colleagues in Poland and in Czechia, as well as in the GDR and in Russia, who do research on specifically this question. And I think the key thing is that unlike in the West, where sexuality was always about sort of the kind of 4-stage sexual response theory, this idea that the right kind of stimulation, the right kind of technique is going to make it really good for you. The Eastern Bloc countries had a much clearer understanding of sort of the wider social implications. Like if you're really stressed, if you have massive amounts of economic precarity, if you don't know how you're going to pay your rent, or you don't know like whether your kids are going to be able to eat, it turns out it's really hard to get in the mood. And so their conception of sexuality was like a holistic conception of sexuality. It was much more capacious than any sort of discourse that we had in the West during this period of the second wave feminist movement.
So I want to follow up on that just by, bringing up the point that although obviously in the Western world or like within capitalist nations during this time period, you don't see the kind of social provision that the Soviet bloc guaranteed to women. You do see other movements towards sexual freedom. So, during the 1960s, there's, of course, the kind of, new left countercultural sexual revolution, feminist movement, of course, as you were just saying, placed an emphasis on individual autonomy. And I think that in the US, what we've seen in terms of the movement towards sexual freedom has been a kind of combination of like you were just referring to, like a kind of consciousness raising, right? Like we need to kind of understand ourselves and our relationships with other people a little better. And then also legal battles. So decriminalizing, abortion and homosexuality. I think, more recently we've seen the rise of things like affirmative consent laws or, more kind of legislation geared toward preventing sexual assault or what have you. So I guess I'm wondering, and I just want to say, like, obviously in the US, sexual mores or like sexual norms are way less fraught than they were 50 or 100 years ago, right? So it's
Sure.
so progress has been made. So I guess my question for you is what happened in the US just a different way of getting to the same endpoint? And obviously, like, we're not at the, endpoint of like sexual liberation for everybody, but what do you make of that?
Yeah, so the scholar Dagmar Herzog, who has done really wonderful work on sexuality in East versus West Germany, she really talks about sexual revolution versus sexual evolution. And I really like her framing, right? So in the West, sexuality was part of kind of a countercultural movement, right? So to the extent that people were standing up and sort of standing in the streets and saying, this is something that we are claiming for ourselves in opposition to the state. I think that the difference is, and I caught your conversation about whether or not the state should be involved in sex. I think that the difference is that in Eastern Europe, the conditions were made, basically, the sexual evolution was kind of driven in some ways by state policies around sexuality. So East European countries, make abortion illegal before, make abortion legal, before the West, with the very important exception of Romania and Albania and the Soviet Union during the Stalinist era. But the Soviet Union is the first country in the world to make abortion on demand legal in 1920. And it stays legal until 1936 when Stalin reverses it. And then after Stalin's death, it becomes legal again. Homosexuality was decriminalized very early on in the Eastern Bloc, especially in Czechoslovakia, the GDR, and even, ironically, interestingly, in Catholic Poland, where there was a very, sort of robust subculture going on within things that you would not imagine were happening within the communist era. But the reason why, and it's not because it's hard for Westerners to understand this. It's not because people went out in the streets and demanded their rights. It's more because the communist state was really concerned with basically people having babies. Like they wanted women to be in the labor force, but they realized that when women went out into the labor force, if they weren't supported, the birth rate dropped. And part of having a higher birth rate is basically facilitating more sexual activity among your population, right? But then even beyond that, in the case of the GDR and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, which were very liberal in terms of same-sex rights, they also understood that this was much earlier than in the West. They understood that like some people are just that way. And so in Catholic Poland, right, my colleague Agnieszka Kozianska says she found that the communist government would hire priests to allow people who wanted to transition to the other gender to help them along with their transition. This is under communism in Catholic Poland. Why? Because, okay, you're a Catholic man, and we want to make sure that you're going to be a good Catholic woman. or vice versa, right? So the reasoning is really weird. It's not at all about individual autonomy. It's about finding your place within society. And many of these Eastern Bloc countries really cared that people were happy in their relationships because they understood that there were these travel restrictions and these consumer shortages, and there were all these downsides of the regime. We should not gloss over that at all. But I think it's really important to understand that states invested in women's reproductive rights. They invested in extremely liberal sex education books, right? Which give like very detailed instructions on how to please partners, with diagrams and everything, right? So, and if you read the introduction to these books, it's always like, as a socialist society, we have a responsibility to make sure that our citizens are having proper loving socialist sex, so they're not like distorted by the kind of commodified, disgusting, problematic sex of the capitalist world where people are becoming transactions or whatever. So I think it's a very different model. And I like the idea of evolution versus revolution, whereas you can become very sexually liberated without going out onto the streets and demanding certain rights. In the case of Eastern Europe, the state just kind of gave people those rights. Now, there are some exceptions, and there are always going to be exceptions. But there's so many wonderful examples. Josie McClellan has a book called Love in the Time of Communism. And she really talks about the nudist culture, the Freikörperkultur in Eastern Germany, and how initially the state was totally opposed. This is a nudist culture, totally opposed to it. And then when they realized that people were going to do it anyway, because they liked being, there were these nudist camps and nudist beaches, and and then the regime said, yes, this is a wonderful expression of the egalitarianism of socialism. So, I just think it's really important to understand that the political economy is very different in these two contexts, but the outcomes can be very similar.
Yeah, I think that what you said about this kind of idea of I guess like a top-down or like a state-directed kind of social policy being anathema to Americans. That's so true. I mean, I think that, even or especially on the left, we don't like to think of any kind of social movement as coming out of anywhere but like the bottom, like the bottom rungs of society, like the grassroots, and I think that so that's just a really fascinating story. And
and yet, sorry, just to interrupt you there. And yet, when we think about the second wave of feminism, right? The first presidential commission on the status of women, which is formed in 1961 by President Kennedy. I'm sorry, that is a top-down. That's a top-down committee. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of that. And that report is published in 1963 at the same time as Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. So we have a myth of the grassroots in our country. But at the end of the day, there was so much that was happening from the top down. It's just that we don't see it and we don't like to talk about it because it violates our feeling of like having fought and, for these hard-won rights, right? In fact, the government was very, very, very much involved, I think.
Yeah, I think that's extremely disturbing to Americans.
Yeah.
They don't
no one
like
wants
the
to hear
idea. I think and the myth about, sexual freedom and the free love movement in America is really grounded in this idea that you have like some libertines who take to this, get in a van and drive to San Francisco and, it's free love and
flowers
music
in
and
their hair.
acid. Yeah. But when you start to unpack that, what you have is like the emergence of teenage culture that's being commodified for the very first time through movies and music and television. And you also have a lot of like extremely disenfranchised, upset youths coming together to try to recreate societies that model the institutional support that you did see under certain Soviet economic structures, right? So that's what a commune is. A commune is a place where risk is shared, where you have food for everybody. The foundation of the free love movement is people trying to make these makeshift sort of top-down structures that influence and allow for certain types of sexual expression and freedom that they wouldn't normally have. But, in the US, our narrative of that is just like, they were just a bunch of cool radicals, like doing it for themselves. Right. They probably would have been a lot better off if, they had actual state support for food and housing. You'd have a lot fewer cults and maybe the Manson family wouldn't have existed.
Right. Exactly. Or Jonestown, right? I mean, the other thing, I think that like Kate Wygand has this wonderful book called Red Feminism. There's also Eric McDuffie's book, Sojourning for Freedom, which really talks about the ways in which sort of Black feminism in this country has its roots in the CPUSA. A lot of feminist organizers were labor organizers or had socialist roots. And so we've really whitewashed that out of our history of feminism. The idea that there was a first wave that got suffrage and then a second wave, in the 60s and 70s. There's like a whole, like Dorothy Sue Cobble has this argument about the missing wave of feminism, which is all the socialists and communists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I think that, women who are interested in like women's emancipation and sexual liberation and all of these questions, we really do ourselves a disservice by ignoring the existence of this sort of quote unquote missing wave of women, because there were many, many women who were there on the front lines fighting for things like birth control, fighting for things like all sorts of women's participation in unions and, all sorts of things that get sort of like whitewashed out of the women's movement later when it really becomes more about, white women getting access to professions that they were otherwise shut out of, or being able to go to Harvard or Yale or Columbia or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. You see this with the welfare rights movement, where it's primarily women of color saying, I have the right to state assistance and it cannot be denied because my like boyfriend is staying with me.
Right.
Yeah.
That is an extremely powerful intervention. And I think one that gets left out of the conversation a lot, because they're talking about their right to sexual and economic freedom, to support and to dignity and respect and privacy.
Absolutely. And like, and this goes beyond the United States. I have this other book called Second World, Second Sex, which really looks at the intersections between East European women's organizations and women's organizations in the Global South. And I'm really struck by how women in the Global South in particular talk about how, East European women from these state socialist countries were really important allies because the feminism that they wanted to instantiate was a feminism that required public provision of basic services. It was not about a kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, micro loan, entrepreneurial, social entrepreneur feminism, right? Which is like what we've ended up with, unfortunately, today. But there was a whole different model, which was really about making claims on the state, making sure that the state was responsible for, dealing with the imbalances, right, in the labor market that the free market creates when you have one part of the population that is imagined to be responsible for caregiving, right? So I think that it's really important to talk about the ways in which, even though I understand that it's anathema to Americans to realize that some of these social movements actually really do need support. But that's what democracy, right? When we think about democracy, aren't we actually talking about influencing the state? And economic democracy, I mean, I'm sure, all of your listeners are aware of this argument, right? But obviously, if we are making claims for a certain kind of life that we imagine, things like housing is a human right or healthcare is a human right, to whom are we addressing those claims? We're addressing them to the state, right? So if you live in a world where the state has already given you those things, right, does it make them any less valuable? The argument in the United States is that somehow it does, because since the state gave you women's rights, or the state gave you healthcare, or the state gave you, housing, then it's not really valuable. Whereas somehow if we've demanded it and then only after a really, really long fight somehow gotten it, then it's okay. And just to sort of push this back even further, wouldn't you think of the Russian Revolution as a big fight?
I was literally just about to ask you about that.
Right? I mean, wasn't that a demand? I mean, so a bunch of people got together, they rose up and they demanded something. I mean, they overthrew a state and then created a state of their own. But, I just think that the key question here is, what is the role of the state vis-a-vis society? And for all sorts of questions, whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about healthcare or education or childcare or sexual education or whatever, we have to deal with the state. We can't ignore the state. I mean, in a beautiful world, yes, we could all set up some kind of independent communes out and,
it worked in the 60s.
Yeah, it worked so great.
Exactly. We know, we have experience with some of these things. So I think it's worth really, conceptualizing why it is that Americans have this knee-jerk reaction to that.
So I actually do want to linger on the Russian Revolution for a second, because I know you have written about Alexandra Kollontai, and I know that, after the Bolsheviks taking power, there was a sort of Russian sexual revolution, right? Can you talk about that a little bit? Talk about what kind of factors went into that, and then maybe after that, tell us about why it collapsed.
Okay, so the why it collapsed is really easy. Stalin, that's just there's a one-word answer to that question. But I can elaborate a little bit more on that. But so I think what a lot of people do not realize is that between 1917 and 1936. There were three Soviet family codes. There was a family code in 1918. There was a second family code in 1926. And then there was the family code that Stalin passed in 1936, which reversed most of the progress of the two earlier family codes. And then in 1944, there was a family edict, which made it even worse. So this early moment of sexual revolution in Russia, which I really encourage everybody to read Wendy Goldman's book, Women's State and Revolution. It is a fantastic deep dive into what was going on in Russia, all of the jurisprudence around these various family codes between 1917 and 1936. So Alexandra Kollontai, immediately after the Russian Revolution, is made the Commissar of Social Welfare, and she's extremely influential in setting Soviet family policy. And one of the things that she does is she allows for divorce, which is huge. in a country where the Russian Orthodox Church basically said that marriage was a sacrament that lasted for life, no matter whether or not your husband was an alcoholic or was abusive or abandoned you, right? So Kollontai, gets the women's vote very early on, gets the support of women by allowing women to actually petition for divorces. She also has an incredible article in 1923 called Make Way for Winged Eros, which I've talked about at length on my podcast. And I think everybody should go out right tomorrow morning, first thing, and read this article. It's Make Way for Winged Eros, a letter to working youth. And she does a Marxist political economy of love. And she basically makes this really interesting claim that as society moved from sort of ancient society to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and from capitalism to socialism, our ideal concept of love will change depending on the overall political economy of the societies within which we live. And she really talks about what is necessary in order to move from the capitalist conception of love, where sexuality is a transaction, where love is a transaction, where people become each other's private property, to a more socialist, more welcoming, opening conception of love, where we have a broader social safety net, and therefore we have broader comrades and emotional support and a variety of other things that she goes into great detail in this article. But what she does as Commissar of Social Welfare, Lenin empowers her to actually do things like create public cafeterias and canteens and mending cooperatives and childcare facilities and children's homes. I mean, Kollontai starts kind of completely reimagining what family will look like in the Soviet Union. They experiment with partible paternity, whereby if a woman is having sexual relations with multiple men and she becomes pregnant, then each of those men is the father of the child. So there can be multiple fathers. So she's like, why should we only have one father? Why not have like a mother and three fathers? You can imagine that the Bolsheviks, the men, are not really pleased with what she's arguing here, right? As I said, abortion becomes legal in 1920. And there's all of this discussion about sexuality, about sexual freedom, about women's emancipation, what it means to have some kind of like sexual, relationship as a part of the revolution, as something that will support revolutionary goals. So all of this foment is happening in the early years of the revolution. Unfortunately, as I'm sure those of you who are familiar with Russian history know, there's the First World War, then there's a terrible civil war, then there is an awful famine. Then Lenin, after war communism, institutes the new economic policy, and basically slowly all of Alexandra Kollontai's work is undone, largely because there is a huge urban population of orphans. And they don't know what to do with these orphans. They were hoping they would be able to put them in really nice, fancy state orphanages. It doesn't work out. They don't have the resources. The Soviet Union is really struggling economically. And then Lenin dies, and then Stalin comes into power. He sort of puts up with, Kollontai gets exiled. She ends up going off into diplomatic service. They just want her out of the way because her ideas about sexual freedom and love are just too crazy. And then in 1936, as I said, because the birth rate is plummeting, because Stalin is totally paranoid that he's going to be invaded by the Germans at any minute, which turns out, not to be completely false. But in 1936, he passes a very strict family code that reverses all, makes it more difficult to get divorced, makes abortion illegal, basically takes all of the social infrastructure that was trying to communalize housework, the public cafeterias and the canteens and the mending cooperatives and the child homes, and sort of does away with them to try, doesn't completely, but basically really establishes the nuclear family as a place where most of the care work and child rearing is going to be done in order to preserve resources for the expansion of the Soviet economy and eventually, the defense of the Soviet Union against what at the time Stalin sees as an imminent Western attack.
Mm-hmm. I think so. following from that, I do want to ask you a question about the nuclear family, I guess, because I think on the left, we sometimes hear this idea of the abolition of the family, right? Like this famously comes up, of course, in the Communist Manifesto. And I do want to be clear, I think, at least from my reading, what Marx and Engels were getting at was not that they were like, we need to abolish the nuclear family, like nobody can be in a nuclear family. My reading, at least, is that they were saying there's a kind of bourgeois ideal of the nuclear family that's imposed on the working class, but the working class actually, because of capitalism and exploitation, can never really achieve that ideal. And I think that Kollontai gets at that in some of her work as well. But I think what's interesting is both in Marx and Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, and I believe in Kollontai's pamphlet Communism in the Family, they both acknowledge that this is like abolishing the family is a deeply unpopular idea. Like even though they acknowledge that this bourgeois ideal is hurting the working class, they're like, we have to be really careful because nobody really wants to abolish the family. So I guess I'm wondering if you have thoughts on whether abolition of the family is a useful framework for sort of thinking through ideas of sexual freedom and even gender justice.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So like if we had like 5 hours, I could really get
just a small question.
Because I think about this a lot.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? And like right now I'm reading around this question from an anarchist point of view, from a utopianist point of view. I'm coming at this from a lot of different ways, not only from the communist and socialist point of view. So the one thing that I will say is that a lot of people don't realize that Engels wrote 2 drafts of the Communist Manifesto in 1847 before the 1848 version that he co-authors with Marx. And in those 2 drafts, Engels actually says that children should be taken away from their mothers and raised communally as early as possible. So basically, it's kind of left vague, but you get the sense that it's sort of after weaning, right? That language, interestingly, is taken out of the Communist Manifesto. And I would love to know why. If it, was it Jenny Marx? Like what exactly happened in that room when they decided, that's kind of a little too radical. Like we're going to like overthrow the world, but like we shouldn't, let children be taken away from their parents. And so we actually do have some good empirical data on this when we look at the kibbutzim in Israel, because early kibbutzniks actually did raise their children in common away from their parents. And so, this is, and it didn't work out so well for a variety of reasons when the children slept away. But when they went back to a model where the children slept with their parents, but were at daycare all day, then it ended up working out a lot better. And there are all sorts of different questions about why it was, some people say that the women that cared for the children at night were less attentive than the women who cared for the children at day. But anyway, this is, we can get into the weeds of this discussion. Like I said, there's a lot of really interesting empirical data that we can talk about when we talk about what is the best for children. But the nuclear family, look, the key thing about the nuclear family that both Marx and Engels, as well as Kollontai and Zetkin and August Bebel and all of these early socialist theorists were honing in on, was that the nuclear family is the vehicle for the intergenerational transfer of property, right? And if we raised our children more collectively, it would be easier for us to pass on our property more collectively, right? Like we would be less attached to property, right? And so what Kollontai says is that that the problem with what happened in the Soviet Union is they really focused on the political economy, they focused on the public sphere, and they really didn't want to deal with the private sphere, partially because most of the leaders in the Soviet Union were men. And, they weren't really willing to challenge the coziness, right, of their domestic situations the way that women like Kollontai really were. And I would argue women like Inessa Armand, for instance, as well, or Clara Zetkin, like they were really out there on the front lines of this issue. And, to his credit, August Bebel as well. So, but when we talk about the abolition of the family, I think that we need to make a distinction between first of all, what is the family? When we talk about the nuclear family, we're talking about two parents and their immediate offspring. But in other cultures, the definition of the family is a much more capacious one, right? Mm-hmm. There's a much more extended vision. And I don't necessarily think that when people are talking about the abolition of the family, they're talking about the abolition of the extended kin network, right? Mm-hmm. Or what we call like alloparents, like fictive kin. In anthropology, where you have like, Auntie Alma, who, like my daughter had who was like my college roommate, was as close to my daughter as any blood relative, right? Even though we were not related. So you have to be really careful about the word family. But I think that the reason why this is such a nerve that gets struck is precisely the same way that people misread Marx when he talks about religion being the opiate of the masses. Mm-hmm. And if you read that full part of the text, what you see is that, Marx says that religion is the soul in a soulless world, right? Mm-hmm. Like religion makes this bearable, but it also ends up kind of making us complacent, right? And not fighting against the system. So it's this kind of dual-edged sword. And I would say that the family is a really similar kind of thing. We need, like, the family, our relationships with the people that we love, whether they're consanguineous or not, are really important to us. And so to the extent that people think of family in whatever definition that is as a group of people coming together and sharing love and resources, very few people are going to want to abolish that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, however you define that idea of like a shared commitment to love and mutual support and nurturance is what makes like capitalism bearable for most of us. But I think when we talk about the family as a very specific institution that upholds and underpins patriarchal capitalism, right? So that corporations can increase their profits by exploiting the unpaid labor of caregivers in the home. When we're talking about the abolition of the family, we should be very clear that what we're trying to say is like, the family as this myth which produces value for capitalist society out of love and care, that's what we're trying to trouble. That's what we're really trying to complicate, is the myth of the family as a shield or a veneer or a veil over what is, at the end of the day, a very exploitative relationship, as mm-hmm. people like Silvia Federici have written about, right? As opposed to like, let's make kin, right? I actually think that rather than abolishing the family, I think that's the wrong word. We need to radically expand the family. Mm-hmm. We need to like have as many lateral relationships with people in our lives and bring them in as kin as we possibly can. And that, I mean, some people might say, well, that's basically abolishing the family. But I would say, actually, I think that's like making the family as a concept more capacious and more valuable for kind of fighting against this extremely oppressive and exploitative economic system, which requires all of the emotional and caregiving labor that is done in the private sphere, but is not in any way willing to pay for it.
Yeah, it treats that as external. If you model this in economics, it treats all of that as external to the model. It's like, oh no, we don't really need to get into that, right. Even though it's foundational to this model functioning. And you see so many state programs directed towards defining the family and delineating it. It is actually a category that has to be controlled and enforced. And you Absolutely. See that so often. It really puts the lie to the, kind of quaint and naive, like, it's just loving people coming together, signing a contract with the state.
Right.
Exactly. And I will say that some of the places that you can really see this are in states, and I believe the Netherlands as well, where they are trying to allow children to have more than two parents, right? Yeah. So either because of step parents or because of same-sex couples that want to, include either the egg or the sperm donor in the parental unit, they want to have 3 or more parents. And like, our states freak out. Like, they don't want to conceptualize at more than 2. Yeah. And that, I mean, the reality of our lives with reproductive technologies and just with step parents and serial monogamy and the way that we live, right? We need to have a world in which there are more than the possibility of more than 2 parents exist. And that's where we really see the state pushing back, right? Because then there are property relationships that get complicated.
Yeah,
right?
and tax relationships.
Tax relationships. Absolutely. Yeah. You have 3 people claiming this person is a dependent instead of 2. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which I think the state is very invested in a particular version of the family. And that's the version when we're talking about abolishing the family, that's the version that we're talking about, right? Because I think you look at, there are polyamorous relationships that complicate this. What about like, and asexual people who are living together and want to have relations? There's so many ways in which contemporary life and contemporary sexuality has kind of grown out of the model that we have. I mean, and certainly the model that Alexandra Kollontai was operating with when she was writing Communism and the Family, right? So what we really need to do as feminists and as socialists is to go back and say, okay, well, what do we mean when we say the family? And maybe like watch, because like people, I mean, I think, when you say abolish the family, people freak out.
Yeah, it's
they really do.
Troubling.
It is troubling.
The way I think about it is, for a long time, you could share your Netflix password and username with anyone you wanted, right? And you could have a bunch of different users sharing a resource. And then they're like, no, we've tracked your IP address.
One household.
Yeah, exactly.
One household.
We see the way that these things are arranged. My example's a little bit facetious, but I think it's relatable. And, currently, I can't remember what state it's in, but there's a law to allow women who are pregnant to sue for paternity to cover medical bills, and the state will enforce. It's Utah.
Yeah,
and they're saying this is a pro-life law, right? This is about supporting the mother, making sure she's healthy, making sure her medical expenses are covered. I think that kind of gets to the nucleus of this idea that even before the baby is born, you have these 2 people who are responsible for covering the healthcare, the food, the well-being of the mother to make sure there's a healthy child.
And the state won't help you, but you can ask the dad, or you can
sue the dad. Yeah, because that's super easy and always works.
I agree with all of that, and not to like open up a new can of worms, but I do want to ask you, Kristen, like it's not clear to me that capitalism can't absorb like changing family structures. So that
I was gonna say,
because like I just want to mention really quickly, like we know, at least in the US context, when inequality is really high, we see a marriage gap between professional affluent people and working class people. So, right now, working class people are way less likely to get married than their, affluent counterparts. And it's not because they don't want to. It's, there are all of these different factors, which we've basically spent the whole show discussing. But that's just to say that, marriage rates are clearly plummeting for the working class, but like capitalism's stronger than ever. So that, I just, like I said, I don't think it's clear to me that simply expanding our idea or like our conception of what family is sufficient in and of itself.
No, and that's why I believe that it has to be absolutely concomitant with expanded social safety nets, right? Because the thing is whether or not you're married, right? Whether, if your parents get ill, that responsibility largely falls on you. If your child gets ill, that responsibility, like the state allows, some states actually allow the government of the state to look to adult children to pay for the nursing home, for instance, expenses of their parents. And so there's a way in which the state actually saves resources by outsourcing services that would otherwise be provided by the state into the private sphere. So I think it doesn't, again, it doesn't matter whether you're married or not married. And definitely there is a huge gap in that. And I think that's absolutely important to point out. But what the key thing is, it's about the conception of the private sphere. It's about the conception of who is responsible for certain kinds of care work. And, ever since the 80s, there was a wonderful paper by Diane Elson who talked about what neoliberal austerity does. Neoliberal austerity, when you slash public services for healthcare or for childcare or for elder care, that labor doesn't go away. It just gets transformed into the private sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that whether or not, especially during the last year of the pandemic, everybody is scrambling to deal with, lack of childcare, lack of school, all of these things, and realizing that what the state has just done, for because of the pandemic, has just sort of been moved it into the private sphere. And so when I talk about, it's not just expanding the definition of the family. It's about reimagining the family as something that is not in the private sphere, but that necessitates investments from the public sphere, right? So you have to understand that there's a kind of redistributive power that the state has. And, we can get into the weeds and talk about whether that's state ownership of the means of production or taxation and redistribution or communal ownership of the algorithms of the robots that will one day control us, whatever it is that you want to, you want to get that revenue stream from the state. It's not just going to be about infrastructure or some kind of like tangible market goods, but also about funding and supporting and providing a floor for all citizens under which they will not fall. Mm-hmm. And so that we understand that when we use the word family, we're talking about family as not something that is only in the private sphere, but that is a legitimate claimant on socialized resources. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I got really excited by Jen's question because it overlaps with what I wanted to ask. Because, throughout this conversation, we've been talking about two kind of tensions or dichotomies. One is, the capitalist conception of love is extremely transactional. And then you can see the way in which the state literally writes that into law or policy or code. And the socialist conception, as you said, was more relational. Social pleasure is a social good. Desire is a kind of inertia within society that needs to be cultivated and expanded. But in the US, we've got this extreme focus on individual rights, individual access. And I think the question of abolishing the family draws that tension out. So we see that sexual liberation and sex ed are focusing on individual choices and responsibility, and then individual freedom, right? And it assumes two things. It assumes, one, that the kind of coded structure of loving relationships, whether it be the family or, boyfriend or girlfriend, the way that those get fractured by property relations is immutable. And then it assumes a secondary thing, which is that neoliberal austerity is transhistorical and permanent, right? We'll never get past it. So the only intervention we can make is to let women be proud of getting an abortion, right? Yeah. We can't make the intervention of creating that floor, like you said. So I think we've seen some sort of interesting movements come out of this, and they've been successful to varying degrees, but they haven't really focused so much on redistribution and material resources as the floor of the right to pleasure, to freedom of expression, whether it be for your gender or your sexuality, and to expanded kin networks, which are the basis for most people's relationships, I think. It's not, most people aren't existing in just a delineated nuclear family. And part of that is because of capitalism placing so much stress on that you have two workers and you have nannies and people who help with your household that become part of this expanded but marketized kinship network. So I wanted to ask, we see a lot of people talk about the possibility for subverting the dynamics of capitalism through queer relationships or through certain types of sexual orientations or different constellations of partnerships like polyamory. Do you feel like that will go all the way to that'll get us where we need to go? I don't want to say these aren't revolutionary acts, but I think I want to try to relate that desire and the kind of politics that people are embedding in those types of sexuality to the conversation that we're talking about material and economic redistribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the sticky question, right? I mean, because on the one hand, I do think that anytime so I've been lately, I've been spending a lot of time reading about co-housing. And eco-villages and the ways in which co-housing, like very concretely, if people come together and they live in much smaller dwellings and they share common resources like, common kitchens or common, appliances or whatever, there are really sort of direct ecological impacts of this, right? So the carbon footprint of these people who are living in these facilities or these complexes is much lower than people who are living in individual single family homes. And as well as the fact that people are less isolated and they're less lonely, they report higher life satisfaction. And women also, there's one great 2010 study that shows that women do a hell of a lot less housework when they're living in co-housing complexes, right? So there's an interest. But what does that mean? That means that you're living with a kind of a group of people. There's some privacy, but there's a lot of sociality that's sort of built into these co-housing. And this is analogous to what you're talking about. So some people say, oh, well, co-housing will fix it, right? We'll fix so many problems. It'll like lower our carbon footprint and we'll become more gender egalitarian and we'll, have better relationships and be less isolated. But then lo and behold, what happens is that capitalism comes in and all these developers are now bringing, building co-housing and making a pretty penny on, essentially commodifying people's loneliness and isolation, which I just find so depressing. And I fear that some of the narrative around, having sort of non-heteronormative relationships as a kind of way to undermine capitalism, that the same sort of thing happens to that it's very easy to co-opt that into the logics of capital. And that the key move that we're talking about is this idea of expanding social safety nets so that so much of the labor and caregiving that is done in the private sphere becomes the concern of the entire society. Our definition of the family is something that is in need of and legitimately should have the support of socialized resources in some way. So it's like this sort of it's always this kind of tension of like, okay, well, we can take the first steps of co-housing or, living in an eco-village or, trying to push against the status quo by living in what are called like pocket utopias, right? So you sort of cordon yourself off. You build a world or a community. And in fact, one of the really interesting co-housing communities that I was studying is a over 55 LGBTQ plus community, right? Where they're building a co-housing facility so they can all live together and like have a great time. And I think that's fantastic. And to the extent that they're lowering their carbon footprint and to the extent that they're finding community with each other, that's great. Does it actually end up challenging the larger status quo? There's even some evidence that it might end up perpetuating certain kinds of health inequalities because housing is very expensive and it tends to be a certain kind of liberal, wealthy, white, middle class group of people who opt for this kind of housing. I mean, I think, on the one hand, I want to say, and especially steeped as I am in the history of the East European context of like, how far do we go? And are we really going to throw shade on people who are trying to take baby steps rather than the big leaps that we think are necessary? I struggle with that all the time because on the one hand, I sort of think, well, if everybody took baby steps if everybody could sort of, imagine a sort of post-heterosexual monogamous nuclear family relationship, we would raise our children and we would all become sort of more cooperative. That's one way of thinking about it. But then the other part of it is, well, no, maybe that just ends up becoming a way to reproduce privilege and inequality. And I think it's really, really hard to parse those things out. So it's sort of like, on the one hand, I think it's a necessary but not sufficient step towards the kind of world that many of us are imagining. And again, like I don't want to belittle the importance of that step, but at the end of the day, I do think we have to think beyond just making certain kinds of tweaks in our private lives and really think about transformational politics in the public sphere much more widely.
So, Kristen, I think we have to let you go now, but I just want to say thank you for coming on. And I hope that lots of people clicked on this video because it has sex in the title and then got a talk on the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
We didn't even show the more salacious graphics that we had prepared.
I was kind of a little bit embarrassed.
Flash those really quickly. There
you go.
Clitorises, ladies, gentlemen, and others.
In Russian.
It's actually in Bulgarian. But
okay.
What's so great about that little, I think that's so interesting because it's sort of a diagram for men of, this is what it looks like when it's normal. This is what it looks like when it's aroused. And this is what it looks like right before the orgasm.
So then you can track your progress.
Yeah.
If that's what your goal is.
But the idea that a communist government, right? Think about what you know about the Eastern Bloc in the 20th century, right? And to think that this book was like the second most popular book in the GDR, right? After like a gardening handbook, it's upside down. Yeah, there you go. And the fact that it was translated into so many languages. It was in Cuba, it was in Bulgaria. There's another version of it in Bulgaria. It went to Czechoslovakia. It actually made it to West Germany because it was so, detailed. Like, it just goes to show you that it doesn't require, Schnabel, the guy who wrote the book, he was a state-funded sexologist. All of his research was being funded by the East German state. And here he was. The very first pages of this book are about the orgasm gap. Like, men have this many, women have this many. This is a problem. We are an egalitarian society. We need to have a more egalitarian distribution.
Yeah. Let's apply redistribution everywhere.
Right.
Let's apply redistribution everywhere. And I just think, when people, I'm not making this up, right? It's literally in black and white. Like, if you can read Bulgarian or German, you can read it for yourself, So, and I think what people's imagination of 20th century state socialism is just really hard for them to get their head around that, right? That it was a concern, and that sex education and good quality, high quality sex education, right? Like real sex education, not only about, preventing STDs and birth control, but actually about pleasure, right? That was part and parcel of these East European societies. Again, because, as I said, they thought of sexuality as a social good, right? The more and the better it was, the happier the people would be, and the more harmonious the society. It's a weird way of thinking about it, but it is how they thought about it, and they spent a lot of resources and expended a lot of expertise in talking about it. So I think it's always worth trying to get outside the United States and thinking about how these things are discussed and conceived of, in not only other countries but in other political economic contexts.
Yeah, very different than the consent forward legalistic framework that we have now. And really good because you can't say what you don't like if you don't know what you do like. So allowing people to understand themselves and others helps with consent. We just need to, we've got to broaden it out for everything in the US.
Absolutely.
Redistribute pleasure, redistribute resources, and do what you want.
Exactly.
With who you want. As long as they want it to.
Right. And we would all be so much happier if we weren't worried. There's this epidemic of precarity. And, we're talking about the pandemic of the coronavirus. But let's talk about the pandemic of precarity, the pandemic of isolation, the pandemic of mental health problems that capitalism has engendered in our society. Like, if Mark Fisher's work here on capitalist realism is so important. I think that we have to really think, that when we're talking, I get criticized all the time for how could you talk about sex, right? In Eastern Europe, like those societies were so awful, Stalin and
I think we had a couple comments like that.
Yeah, I mean, I understand, and I it's fair enough that that's a fair critique. Like that just seems so. To people, who lived in Eastern Europe, or to people who think about the real atrocities of some of these East European countries, they're thinking like, what? So what? Right? They had good sex education. Yeah. So what? They had reproductive rights. So what? Women had equal status. Well, I think that the interesting thing here is, well, yeah. So what? What does that actually mean? And how did they manage that? Given that they were so totalitarian and authoritarian and evil, as you think, that they could have easily done away with those things, as they did, by the way, in Romania after 1966. They just could have, they didn't have to do it. So why did they? Yeah. That's the interesting question.
And why did it work?
And why did it work?
Yeah, it doesn't mean that to take those lessons means you are then becoming totalitarian. You can look at Iceland, you can look at Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, you can look at France. In Japan, they're paying people to take time off of work to have sex.
Exactly.
This isn't limited to this, but your work does such a great job of parsing out the exact dynamics between individual feelings and experiences and state institutions. And I'm just so grateful we were able to have you on. I feel like we could talk to you for another 5 hours.
I know. We should go back to the abolish the family question. I've got a lot to say.
Oh, believe me, we will. That's a follow-up episode now. Jen and I talk about this a lot.
Yeah, so you're definitely invited to round 2.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that in Plato's Republic, I mean, he abolished the family.
He did.
Plato, we were talking a long time ago. He was like, for my guardians, I think it's a better idea if we don't have nuclear families. We should raise our children in common, and and we should have like this sort of group marriage. You tell that to Platonic, scholars or ancient philosophers, and they're like, yeah, well, we sort of ignore that part. We don't want to talk about that because that's a little bit difficult to comprehend. So. Yeah,
we'll have to have you back. You can give us like a literary review of Abolish the Family.
Of the family. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you. Just been an incredible conversation.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was great.
I could do that forever.
Yeah. Again, I don't know if that's what people were expecting who clicked on a video with sex in the title, but this is what you got. So
it's what you're always going to get, actually, it's on the Jacobin Show.
Yeah. So welcome to the Jacobin Show. I want to just remind everybody really quickly to please hit like and subscribe so we can get Kristen Ghodsee back, as well as plenty of other guests. Any last words, Ariella? I just want to remind everybody that Ariella's book, Socialist Sex Ed, is forthcoming from Verso. That'll be out at some point in 2022. So stay tuned. We will be talking more about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, we should have a follow-up show with Kristen. And I would just remind people to read her books. Her work is incredible. I love the kind of political anthropology that she's doing. I think that we need more of this. She has a level of nuance and respect for the subject, incredible researcher and historian. I just can't recommend them highly enough.
Agree. Yeah, I mean, I guess on that note, thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, good night, and keep expanding your kin networks.
Good night, guys.